Well, good afternoon. My name is Trevor Harrison. I'm director of Parkland Institute, and I hope you've had a wonderful weekend. I know I certainly have. It's been a fabulous conference, hasn't it? It's been amazing, amazing. And I have no doubt that we're going to conclude this afternoon with another amazing talk because everything has just run incredibly smoothly here. I want, before we get to the speaker, and again, I know that's why you're here, I want to just make a few thank yous. Thank you to certain sponsors we have for this conference. The Alberta Federation of Labour, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Civic Service Union Local 52, Health Sciences Association of Alberta. They do that every year. I should have anticipated that, actually. The Non-Academic Staff Association at the U of A, the United Nurses of Alberta. Okay, come on. There's a friendly rivalry there, if you haven't noticed it. University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts and Wordsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. Congratulations, or thanks to all of everybody. I want to thank the media sponsors for their generous support, Alberta Views Magazine and CJSR Radio Edmonton. A few big thanks also to some small businesses here that have really helped us out as they do every year. First, to Earth's General Store for their freshly roasted, freshly ground fare. Boy, there's a lot of F's in there. That's Trade Coffee and other fair trade products that we served over the weekend. To Bonton Bakery for the fabulous pastries, and I did have way too many of them. And the Upper Crust for catering our lunch yesterday. And most importantly, thanks to the many volunteers who have made this conference so successful. We couldn't do this conference without the support of those volunteers every year. We had 45 volunteers this year who helped make this conference happen. This includes all the session facilitators and the other folks who have been around the conference making everything work. Parkland cannot thank you enough, so big thanks to all those volunteers. Special thanks to Mark Copen. Mark, where's Mark disappeared again here? For ensuring that we get both audio and video recordings of this conference for our website. To Rob Butts for all his effort in keeping our conference website operational and online. And to Flavio Rojas for all the conference design work. And for all those we don't have time to name, thank you. I'd now like to ask all the volunteers to please stand up to be recognized. Any of the volunteers here? Wonderful jobs. One of the largest thank yous, as always, I have to give goes out to my incredibly able and dedicated staff for all the hard work they've done over the years and to make this particular conference happen. Gail Davey, our Program and Development Coordinator. Gail, are you here? Please stand up. Scott Harris, our Communications Coordinator. Charlene Oliver, our Administrative Coordinator for keeping track for all the registrations. Charlene, where are you? And although he always leaves his name off here, a big hand to Ricardo Acuna. Ricardo. Please remember that Parkland receives no corporate or government funding. Events like this one are only possible because the generous donations we receive from individuals like you and the organizations you belong to. If you haven't filled out a pledge form yet, please do so and drop it off at the Parkland table, and feel free to take extras to pass along to your friends. Please also drop off your name tags in the box outside the door. We reuse these regularly, and besides which, you really don't want to have them stack up over time. Also, one last reminder to please take a few minutes to fill in your conference evaluations. We'll do a debrief on the conference in the next couple of weeks. We value those things incredibly. They are so important in us deciding how we're going to change things or continue things in future conferences. finally, to the moment you've been waiting for. It's my great pleasure to introduce Erika Shaker. Erika is Director of Education and Outreach for the National Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ottawa. She researches, speaks, comments, and writes on a wide variety of education-related issues, from early childhood education to K-12 to post-secondary. Areas of interest include corporatization, privatization and commercialization, standardization and authentic assessment, funding equity, intergenerational inequality, and community engagement. She also edits the popular education journal Our Schools, Ourselves, which has recently gone digital. Prior to joining the CCPA, she worked in Washington, D.C., monitoring the corporatization of childhood, and eventually co-founded the now defunct Center for Commercial Free Public Education, formerly based in Oakland, California. Erika has 2 kids currently in the public education system after having benefited from an excellent community-based, cooperatively run neighborhood daycare. She spends far too much time on social media, we all do, posting about politics, pop culture, and sarcasm, and is also increasingly worried about the death of irony. So, with no more ado, welcome, Erika.
Can I move this up? Since I'm going to just, if that's okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Is there too much sound? Is there too much, am I breathing into this? Is it, okay, awesome. So as Trevor mentioned, I focus on education for the CCPA. But in retrospect, it appears that for the past few years, at least to some extent, my work has also focused on the issue of populism. What it looks like, the trends that drive it, and in what direction. And this is the best part for me, what tools are available to us as progressives to push back against the rise of the various forms of right-wing populism that are busy gutting our communities while hiding behind the language of empowerment. So when Trevor asked me if I would be able to join you here this weekend, I was really excited to say yes. I thought I'd give myself a little bit of time to write my keynote because, of course, we were in the midst of an election campaign, and I didn't want to write it before that because I figured it might have something to do with what I might say. And given what was revealed and reinforced about the political moment, I think that was probably a good decision, but I am not going to lie, I really struggled with this talk. So I actually, hang on. Yes, accidentally I changed the title, so we're going to call this a subtitle. In the current political climate, where do we find convergence on policy? Well, post-election, I felt like I had just recovered from the flu. I was drained by a nagging sense that we had just emerged from a 40-day-long shrug, cringe, facepalm, eye roll, whatever you want to call it, where with few exceptions, actual policy discussion was sidelined and obscured by memes, very messy rhetoric, and very headline-clutching antics. And after all this, we arrived at a conclusion where a sufficiently sized percentage of the popular vote decided less bad seemed to be enough for now. Thanks to an electoral, I love the Beaverton. Thanks to an electoral system long past its best before date, where political nuances were flattened almost beyond recognition, and we were told division ruled the day. Yes, elections are an important measure of political engagement, of course, but they're not the only one. They talk about fairness and social progress, but they certainly don't guarantee either. So it's important to differentiate between election wins and progressive gains. They aren't disconnected, but they are distinct. Elections are by nature short-term, an attempt to distill prevailing conditions into a focused narrative that speaks to what the party in question assures us they'll do. And of course, it's about all sorts of other things that either reinforce or undercut those narratives or brands. I also just quick shout out to whoever decided to host this in the only non-branded auditorium in the building, apparently, so thank you for that. But because of their short-term nature, they can be quite superficial, perhaps we've noticed, reducing actual policy content to a villain and a savior, or at least people auditioning to be cast as a savior. They limit the range of debate points to what fits into a campaign platform, while leaning heavily on soaring rhetoric. For the people, choose forward, come with us, working for you. They involve props and costumes, usually a hard hat and rolled up sleeves. And policy implemented as a result of electoral promises can be reversed the next election. Hell, it can be reversed the next year by the same government. And since we're all friends here, can we admit that the current electoral system is a case study in fomenting disengagement and cynicism, better known as strategic voting? Voting out of fear, voting out of fear for something worse than what we currently have, rather than voting with conviction for the policies we want to see. Civic engagement is a much more complicated process than marking an X every 4 years or fewer. But as governments bemoan the rise of populism and promote get-out-the-vote campaigns, they might want to consider how inadequate electoral systems contribute to the sense of political disillusionment or feeling dismissed that's so often at the root of populist sentiment. When the post-election dust settled, it's still settling, as progressives do, we tried to look on the bright side of things. We tried to look for potential wins, where we can actually make gains in a minority situation. And it turns out that there is a fair bit of policy that unites rather than divides. Vote totals told us an interesting story. 56% of voters cast their ballots for parties that supported federal pharmacare and urgent action on affordable housing. 30%, which is just short of the 33% that delivered the Liberals almost half the seats this election, voted for platforms that pledged to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, supported parties that advocated for aggressively ramping up climate action, making changes to the NAFTA 2.0 agreement, moving ahead with a wealth tax on the super rich, and fully implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. 57% voted for parties that favored running deficits over reducing services and budget lines. And 30% voted for parties whose platforms did not include a broad $6 billion tax cut that will only result in small reductions in individual taxes, disproportionately benefit the wealthiest families, and jeopardize our ability to fund important public services. But when it comes to long-term social progress, clearly there's a significant amount of convergence on some key policy reforms grounded in universality, inclusion, reconciliation, equity, sustainability, and community. And that is encouraging and suggests we do have a good foundation to build on. But the question remains, how do we start? Populism is more or less politically neutral. Quote, the quality of appealing to or being aimed at ordinary people. Where it gets ideologically specific is in the application, particularly in who or what is identified as the scapegoat, the cause of society's hardships or challenges. Often the definition refers to elites, but who or what is considered an elite can change depending on those driving the agenda. So because of this, elites can range from those in positions of economic or social power, who we might consider the actual elite, to simply those who I think have it too easy, who receive some kind of government assistance, or even those who have job security and paid sick days, because I sure don't. At the beginning of each calendar year, we at CCPA identify the wealthiest Canadians, the actual elite, in our CEO report to highlight the huge degree of inequality in today's society. This report and others on our website, which I encourage you all to download and commit to memory, also supports allied campaigns calling for policy solutions like ending income hoarding, progressive taxation, eliminating tax havens, and a higher minimum wage, for example. That definition of elite seems fairly straightforward. I think people are probably with me on that. But spend even a small amount of time on social media or corresponding with some of your relatives or accidentally bumping into something from the Sun media chain, and it becomes clear that a lot of work and creativity is going into reframing who qualifies as a member of the elite. And it's a long and varied list. I threw a few up there. It's also incomplete, and it can change. It's very amorphous. So we'll just go through the new elite people: Indigenous people, people in unions, public sector workers, teachers, people with an arts degree, people living with disabilities, visible or invisible. If you're Doug Ford, parents of kids with autism, students, artists, people in cities, millennials, refugees. I speak quickly, I'm sorry. Immigrants, people who go to libraries, don't forget them. Women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ2+ community who are aware of, let alone fight to reject, systemic inequality, women who work outside the home and put their kids in childcare, people who compost, and cyclists. There are more. There are legion. Simply put, to reassert their place at the top of the power pyramid, some of the wealthiest, the most privileged, and the most secure, and their proponents have redefined the elite as anyone who challenges the inherent rightness of the current status quo or demands that we do better for each other. And bonus points if those upstarts are a recipient of something that needs to be redefined as an entitlement in preparation for it to be slashed in the name of resilience or self-reliance or cutting the fat or finding efficiencies. Note that tax cuts for corporations or the wealthiest among us do not qualify. Hey, Joel. How are you? That wasn't a, I just noticed you there. Sorry. When it comes to social movements, the right-wing populism has a much easier job of repackaging existing negative misconceptions targeting already marginalized or vilified communities. But progressive populism is much more labor-intensive, hence the title, the original title, not the one I changed it to, because its target isn't a vulnerable community, it's the powerful, the influential, the decision makers. The problem is, when we do focus on the elites, we often find ourselves caught up in debates about the appropriateness of our tactics or being told we're jealous of their success. This criticism is indignantly tweeted at us when we release that CEO report annually. We're also accused quite frequently of not being equally critical of Sidney Crosby or Beyonce. But crucially, the economic and social elites have become and stayed powerful thanks to a system that to a large extent informs how we all live. That system, neoliberalism, is the real target. And that's much more overwhelming. You can go ahead. Sorry. Thanks. Because it's not about those people over there, or you people, as Don Cherry might say. It's everywhere. It's how we live, how we work, and in some cases, how we contribute, how we benefit, and how we define our success. Which means to identify neoliberalism as the culprit requires serious personal and societal deprogramming, and a commitment to ask ourselves some difficult questions. And this is so much harder than simply whipping up latent or active racism or sexism or homophobia or classism about other people. Because self-declared nice people get very defensive when forced to confront how they contribute to and are in a position to ignore or maybe even benefit from systemic oppression. It was only a Halloween costume. It was just a joke. Kids today don't know the meaning of hard work. Avocado toast has become like a metaphor for an entire generation. They can afford for her to stay home and look after their own kids. Calling me a settler makes me feel uncomfortable. I pay your salary. How many public sector workers in here? Why don't we have a straight pride rally? Self-checkout is so much faster, especially when there are so few people working on cash. Funny that. And to make the task even larger, those in a position to do so also find themselves debunking the misinformation underpinning much of the right-wing populist campaigns in the first place, which means sending letters to the editor or hijacking Facebook threads or providing a few key facts to relatives for their consideration. And yes, some of this is futile. There is nothing like sending an email full of links and budgetary information to your aunt. I'm speaking, she's lovely, but I'm speaking from personal experience, to debunk her claim that Mayor Rob Ford, yes, that's Doug Ford's brother, cut property taxes in Toronto, only to have her respond, well, you might be right, but I still feel like I paid less. It's a revealing response about how some people will dismiss facts that simply don't fit what they would like to be true. So when we work for systemic change, we threaten not just those in positions of overall power, but perfectly nice people, neighbors or family members who find it impossible to conceive of something other than the status quo and feel defensive when it's challenged, because it also calls into question their agency, their level of awareness, even their self-declared niceness. And wanting to be seen as nice certainly resonates. It even arguably allows us to confuse being charitable with being progressive. I distinctly remember a friend from university who had kind of taken a racist turn, shall we say, and when I confronted her, insisted that she was a good person because she volunteered at charity golf tournaments. We don't talk anymore. Fighting a battle with nice people's hurt feelings while trying to bring them on side to a total system overhaul is a huge challenge. But it's necessary if we're ever to move beyond this inadequate, unjust, and ultimately damaging status quo. Luckily, there are remarkable shows of solidarity to draw on. Look at any number of international protests in places like Chile and Lebanon, touched off by what's often referred to as pocketbook grievances, but actually speak to much broader systemic issues such as public transportation, access to communication, growing inequality, and other things. That said, I would not include the Canadian version of the original French Yellow Vest movement. The original prototype, while touched off by a gas tax targeting the middle class, was rooted in fury at growing inequality and government austerity policies in Europe. Canada's AstroTurf version was a failed attempt to use the carbon tax to hijack and piggyback on a legitimate expression of class struggle, while a not so thin veneer of anti-immigrant, don't tell me what to do adolescent angst was thrown in. To be clear, people across Canada are experiencing very real anxiety when it comes to affordability, living paycheck to paycheck, holding down several part-time jobs, simultaneously trying to juggle childcare fees and student debt repayment and a lack of public transportation and maybe caring for elderly parents while navigating unmanageable housing costs, just to name a few. Against this backdrop, with provincial and federal governments implementing austerity budget after austerity budget, with a smattering of boutique initiatives that rhetorically acknowledge affordability concerns, while avoiding systemic change and ultimately make the system even more unbalanced, the question remains, in Canada, what does a resistance campaign look like? Austerity and neoliberalism have gutted community infrastructure, attacked unions and workers, and eroded social programs, downloading debt and desperation onto individuals and their families, many of whom are, we know, 1 or 2 paychecks away from financial ruin. And we also know that debt, like precarity, is a huge obstacle to socializing, to forging relationships, to starting relationships, to getting involved more broadly in one's community, in civic engagement, all sorts of things that actually build what we would consider sustainable, robust community. We're a long way from the socialist standard of 8 hours work, 8 hours recreation, and 8 hours rest. Right-wing governments, and hey, Alberta, solidarity from Ontario, will mercilessly exploit the public distrust of large bureaucracies to their benefit, often using misinformation campaigns or deeply flawed systems of measurement to do so. But given its still strong connection to communities, can public education, both as an institution and as a sector, be mobilized as a starting point in charting a new progressive path? Absolutely. But to build a movement, not just a strategy for the next election cycle, we have a lot of work to do. We know that generally people are supportive of their local school, yet come election time are still prepared to accept that it's part of an institutional network, almost a conspiracy, staffed with barely educated people who make at least $100,000 a year working 6-hour days for 8 months of the year. Shortchanging and probably brainwashing every kid in the province, even in the face of research indicating the exact opposite. And it's true, this stereotype draws very heavily from Twitter responses to a Sun Media article focusing on what's happening in Ontario now. It's Brian Lilly. It's no coincidence that education, both as a program and as a physical space, has become one of the last remaining effective rallying points for civic engagement and protest. It's also no coincidence that public education, after years of the slow drip of neoliberal restructuring, is consistently under attack by right-wing governments that benefited from electoral disengagement and dissolution facilitated by those same neoliberal governments posing as progressive. Public education, I'm focusing here on K-12, although, I mean, we don't need to limit ourselves to that. Cradle to the grave education, of course, is a right, is a venue for broad civic and community involvement. With growing disillusionment and disconnection from large government bureaucracies, education on a local level provides us with a valuable opportunity to disrupt right-wing misinformation campaigns in a way that simply providing more data and better information and actual research simply can't. This is what I think. Actually, well-funded, properly funded education that's actually accountable to the public and transparent, because in the absence of that, you will have an onslaught of corporate funding. Witness the 3 halls surrounding the one unbranded hall, each of which are named after Suncor, Chevron, and yeah. We have a corporate mapping project, CCPA, that we do in conjunction with the Parkland Institute that actually monitors some of these things, the influence of the oil and gas industry on public infrastructure. And some of my colleagues just produced an excellent report that does talk about what's happened in the absence of adequate public funding in schools in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the influx of the oil and gas industry money and the influence that's exerted as a result of that, which has huge implications, of course, for even talking to kids about what a just transition and sustainable future look like and whether you can even have those conversations. This is what I think. Education is very well positioned to provide a way into discussions or to facilitate connections that might otherwise never happen. It puts kids and communities at the heart of the conversation. Who is helped, who is hurt, and what don't I know when it comes to what's best for not just my kid. It's inherently about the future, what we want to create for the next generation as opposed to what we want them to be prepared to settle for. It's an opportunity to discover that in spite of tremendous socioeconomic differences, there are clear commonalities in what we want for our kids: to learn, to be excited by learning, to set goals and have the help required to meet them, to have their needs responded to, and to be safe, supported, and welcomed. And it's a segue to discussions about taxation, spending, justice, racism, colonialism, health and well-being, food security, housing, all sorts of topics that some people don't necessarily feel equipped to jump right into, but can find their way to through discussions about the local school. This is coalition building, and it's not a PR exercise. It's an ongoing process. And I'm not talking about a 2-hour meeting at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday with no childcare and no food and nowhere near a major bus route. Years of underfunding, of dollars following students, of insufficient attention paid to the diverse needs of kids and their families, of competition and choice and socioeconomic division have undermined faith in the system. This disillusionment is catnip to right-wingers who ultimately want to further defund the system while reducing its ability to foster community. Because while angst grabs headlines, community builds resistance, the kind that persists and is impossible to ignore regardless of the party in power. We need to build trust from the ground up. And here's another thing. I know we have felt under attack for so long, and the instinct can be to protect what we have or what we had just a few years ago. But if we're going to build a movement and not just restore but enhance social programs, social cohesiveness, and social engagement, holding on to what we have or what we had just before the last round of cuts and restructuring isn't good enough. Neoliberal two-tier is still two-tier, even if some in tier 2 qualify for a tax credit to make it a bit less obvious. However, authentic movement building will only work if we learn how to shut the hell up, listen to the deeply socioeconomically unequal ways in which kids experience school, commit to improving it, and then walk the talk. There are kids There are kids and families and entire communities who have not had the most positive experiences with the education system. including but not limited to the shameful legacy of the state-sanctioned violence of the residential school system and the impact of in-school policing on kids of color. And when funding formulas are designed to cut money out of the system, of forcing artificial divides between core and enhanced services to determine what parents can be asked to fundraise for, when insufficient money is provided to pay the educators legally required to be in schools to maintain staffing ratios, when funding cuts apparently necessitate canceling curriculum designed to meet the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, but not standardized testing, when special education funding or funding for vulnerable students isn't based on meeting needs, but rather on allocating insufficient resources, the divide and the real sense of betrayal only gets worse, particularly when public dollars are siphoned out of the public system to subsidize the private choices some people, generally the already privileged, are in a position to take advantage of. We need to acknowledge this. We need to identify how we got to this point and acknowledge how we have inadequately pushed back against systemic oppression. We need to commit to doing better by listening to those most affected. We need to reject the rhetoric of choice that is designed to keep us divided. And then we need to define progress by how we all are, but particularly the most marginalized, benefiting. Well-meaning public education supporters, and I count myself among them, inside and outside the profession cannot afford the luxury of defensiveness. Too many people were too badly served by any previous high watermark. And right now the stakes at all levels are too high to suggest that we need to be reasonable and strategic and not too demanding, and maybe we just need to turn the clocks back a smidge for now. Public education has another strategic advantage over the right wing. It provides teachers, educators, and education workers with an opportunity to engage directly with parents, kids, and the communities of which they're part. Not all public sector workers have such a direct line of communication, and those who do, like teachers and other education workers, need to be on the front lines of the anti-worker, anti-public education, anti-public services, anti-inequality battle currently being waged by the powerful against everybody else. The Chicago Teachers Union, we heard a little bit about Chicago this morning, but the Chicago Teachers Union is actually a prime example, though certainly not the only one, of the deliberate move from, in the words of their progressive caucus, retail unionism to social justice unionism. They invested in massive membership engagement and created a truth squad, literally a truth squad, to refute right-wing anti-union commentary in the media. They supported, didn't lead, but supported other social justice and community groups in citywide rallies for affordable housing and more effective anti-poverty initiatives, in addition to more funding for public education. They talked about the links between good schools and good communities, and how their work was always about caring for and supporting their own but other people's children. This dramatically changed the relationship between the union and the public, inspiring a nationwide network called Bargaining for the Common Good. The strategy continued in the recently settled strike that used the bargaining process to raise the issue of student well-being outside the classroom, and won, adding 17,000 workers, including nurses and mental health specialists, to help support students who are homeless. That's a good one. They also won more dedicated teachers for English language learners and a declaration that schools in Chicago are sanctuary spaces. Yeah, that deserves one. Interestingly, a state law remains on the books which actually disallows the union for bargaining over anything other than wages and benefits. But according to the Jacobin, the CTU used the power of picket lines and public opinion to revoke it in reality. The teachers' 2012 strike inspired labor and social justice activism across the US, even in so-called red states like West Virginia, where schools in all 55 counties shut down as support for the teachers across and outside the state gained momentum. Oklahoma, Arizona, North Carolina, and Kentucky also saw labor disputes under the Red for Ed banner. And actions are continuing today in Denver, Virginia, Oakland, Sacramento, and Los Angeles. There really is a movement building. Ironically, or maybe not, this activism is not a big city phenomenon. It also has resonance in smaller, more rural communities where there's a higher likelihood of knowing the actual people being vilified, and conversely, lots of opportunities to introduce information into the conversation on a very real one-on-one level. There's also likely to be a greater dependence on public infrastructure. In Canada, this was evident during debates about the closure of rural post offices. Sometimes it's a question of turning a moment into a movement, like the public outrage in Ontario recently, when then Education Minister Lisa Thompson justified significantly larger class sizes by saying that she heard from the business community that kids needed to learn resilience. She just got dragged. Prior to his election victory, Doug Ford found some support from the autism community because of how badly underserved these kids and their families had been. So when his Fix-It plan materialized as a sort of like one-size-fits-all sliding scale voucher mashup that was even worse, the community reacted loudly, furiously, and desperately. And while not every parent has had the experience of a child with autism, every parent does understand the panic of not knowing if they'll be able to provide for and care for their child. So this was a PR disaster for Ford, but it was an actual disaster for families. And it united education workers and teachers and parents and students in demanding good policy, forcing the government off balance, and they're still trying to recover. The pressure was ongoing, and fuel was added to the fire when Ford effectively referred to these parents of kids with autism as entitled. So this is a very revealing interview where the reporter said, well, these are voters, and they are certainly people that are concerned with the cuts. Have you thought about changing direction when it comes to that? Have you thought about the response that you've received? I listen to the real people in the back of the factories. But lots of narratives here, right? But those other people aren't real people. They're real people, but they never voted for me in the first place. They won't vote for me now. They won't vote for me in 100 years. But these are the same people. These are parents of kids with autism, okay? These are the same people that have their hands in the public trough, that have been getting money from the public, hardworking people in the backs of the factories and the offices of small business owners. Our premier, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, the federal election did provide incentive to the province to avoid a massive job action and keep Doug Ford out of the headlines. But there's little question that the sustained connection between education workers, that's CUPE Ontario, and support staff, and these parents and kids who had significant knowledge of the vital work they perform had something to do with the Ontario government's reluctance to have education workers go on strike. Given that all education unions, all the others, are currently in bargaining with the provincial government, filing no boards or finalizing strike votes, the elementary teachers had a 98% strike mandate, Catholic teachers 97%. We're still waiting to hear back MOA's STF. It will be crucial to see how the public rallies in defense of public education and its workers and how they support each other. Laura Walton, president of the education workers represented by CUPE Ontario, referred to this solidarity in her statement to the media after a tentative agreement had been reached with the government. And just to say, her entire statement to the media was just a masterclass in linking demands at the bargaining table to student well-being and community access to services and the role that unions play in pushing back against regressive cuts to public education. So if you can find it, I highly recommend. During their last job action with the Liberals, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario withdrew some services, but really stepped up their communication with the public about what they would continue to do for kids in their care, including corresponding with parents about child safety and well-being, continuing to participate in school breakfast programs, updating individual education plans, and taking kids to extracurricular activities, though not collecting money for those trips. But in a genius move, they refused to administer the provincial standardized test, which was genius. Parents didn't care. You don't have a lot of, that test does not have a ton of supporters outside of government. And kids certainly didn't. But it threw a wrench into the government's fetishizing of all things EQAO, and it messed up scores for that year, making annual comparisons at least temporarily invalid. But it also created a fantastic opportunity to talk about government priorities. Should the priority be on classroom resources or on standardized testing? In this current and very contentious round of bargaining, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation made all bargaining documents publicly available to show what they mean when they say teaching conditions are learning conditions. And it's great because it's actually undermining the government's insistence that they need to think of the students, but their demands are actually providing clear evidence of how they are doing just that. And interestingly, according to their polling, the public is very much on side, which is a bit different for high school teachers. Usually the connection between the public and elementary teachers is much stronger, and it sort of reduces as we move into high school, mostly because there's less connection, because if your child is anything like my kid, you don't want your parents to have anything to do with school, which for me in my line of work is difficult. But no, there is full awareness that this is about class sizes, this is about mandatory online learning, and this is about class size, mandatory online learning. What's the third thing? It's a big one. I'll come back to it. Despite what strategic voting aficionados insist, the right does not succeed because people demand too much. The right succeeds because people are exhausted from being let down by those who prey on their desperation with the status quo and their fragile optimism that this time it will be different. This is why progress has to supersede election cycles. And this is why those working for it need to be so organized, so relentless, so supportive of each other that they will be impossible for governments, regardless of political stripe, to ignore. Don't let them kid you, they are nervous. That's what's behind the campaign to marginalize, condescend, and vilify. But thousands of kids are marching in the streets for safe schools and modern, relevant health curriculum and funding for public education and their right to a green and sustainable future. They are inspiring older generations to take part, and this is apparently terrifying to the right. It's also, ironically, about the only time those same elites get all ornery about kids not being in the same schools they have such disdain for, so just saying. So as we leave this space, and thanks again for the privilege of being here with you today, and take with us what we've learned, let's recommit to avoiding the luxury of defensiveness and remind ourselves that to be made uncomfortable in our privilege and our familiarity with the status quo is a good thing. It's how we learn, how we grow, and how those of us in positions of privilege can work to earn each other's support rather than taking it for granted. Let's acknowledge our own examples of solidarity and community building and learn from them. Quebec's Maple Spring still holds many lessons for patient, methodical, and multifaceted protests that literally brought down a government. It wasn't just a collective, tantrum that's sort of materialized in the streets. It was 18 months of organizing across a province. Let's remember that we have a responsibility to use our privilege in responsible ways, even if we're quite satisfied that our intentions are good and honorable. Let's take every opportunity to question the mantra of choice and merit as concepts that obscure inequity and serve to further divide us. Public funding of private choice is a deliberate strategy to defund a collective commitment to ensuring we all achieve our potential. Let's own up to the fact that our public institutions and infrastructure need to be reclaimed, and that it continues to be in the vested interests of the powerful to continue driving wedges between the people and the institutions we own and that are responsible to us. Let's learn from each other and the people doing the work on the ground. In the education field, Support Our Students Alberta has been sounding the alarm about creeping and, stampeding privatization in education. There's a wealth of knowledge and experience we would all benefit from. Educators for Social Justice in Nova Scotia does fantastic work. Fix Our Schools in Ontario, People for Education, and Le Mouvement in Quebec. We need to know who our friends are, and we need to know who to count on, and we need to know who to learn from. Let's remind ourselves that mentorship doesn't only flow in one direction, that leadership can take many forms, and that being an ally means asking what you can do, not telling what you will do to help. When kids show, and they have shown, that they're capable of organizing a massive provincial walkout in support of their schools and their right to inclusive, relevant curriculum, the next step is not to grab a bullhorn and run to the front of the rally. I say this as someone who has a cousin who carries a bullhorn in his car with him. And a big banner that says corporate criminals must pay. He's been doing this for a while. Let's keep our standards high and make progress with, rather than at the expense of each other. Let's remember that we are many. We are the critical mass. And above all, when it comes to challenging oppression in all its forms, let's be unapologetic, uncompromising, and relentless. The future, ours, my kids, your kids, all our kids, deserves nothing less. And together we're capable of so much more. Thanks. Okay, thanks. If I've gone over, I apologize. I also, as Trevor said, spend far too much time on social media. So if there's something you want to talk to me about, else if it occurs to you afterwards, or if you just want to get in touch, you know where to find me.
Well, I said it's been a great conference, and I knew we were building up to a fabulous crescendo here. I think we did it, right? Now, we still have some time here, and so, Erika, you'd like to take a few questions?
For sure.
Maybe what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then you can respond to them, and then we'll take 3 more and 3 more, and at some point, maybe around midnight, we'll just kind of end it or
When's
so.
my flight?
We can rearrange that, no problem. Okay, so one hand over here, right in front, first one. Take a second, way at the top there. We'll make the runners run. And I need a third one. Where's a third? Is one back here? Oh, just right in, yeah. Okay. Back.
Okay, thanks very much, Erika. It was a very stimulating presentation. After the presentation on Green New Deal, climate change, I've been talking to people about how do we integrate climate action into our fights against the cutbacks. And you mentioned the students going out on strike, and we know in Alberta there's been a mass movement of students going out and protesting and demonstrating. So what I'd like to look at, how we link together these issues of our long-term vision of climate justice together with our fight against the cutbacks and our fight for schools that really are public education for everyone.
Okay.
Thanks. This one up here.
Thanks very much for your excellent presentation and many ideas on building solidarity and public engagement and civil society in general. I'm just wondering if you might elaborate a little bit on, or if you might care to elaborate a little bit on the Supreme Court case about the taxing or the right of not-for-profits for charitable organizations to engage in political activities, and if there's any more legislation that needs to come from that, or even if it's even relevant, right? I mean, like you said, a lot of organizations just build on their civil engagement no matter what the legislation is. But I was just curious about if there's anything upcoming in relation to that Supreme Court decision.
Okay. And the third one just over here. Yeah.
Thank you. And we often talk about the movements that were successes, but one of the things that I wanted to ask was that it's like when things are not going well, when you're not gaining momentum, what are some strategies that you consider to be important for making sure that you're keeping people engaged, even when, you know, victory is uncertain, or things are looking like grim, or you are in Alberta and sometimes feel like you are fighting against absolutely impossible odds. How do you keep people engaged in movements at times like those?
Well, 3 great questions.
I'm going to start with the charity law just because that's probably, so we are a charity, a registered charity, and our mandate is educational. Which literally means our role is to educate the public about policy, different policy options. We did get caught up in the audit of political charities under the previous Harper government, and then it was placed on hold when the Liberals were elected, and it sort of was in this weird state. And then, of course, because Canada Against Poverty challenge the legislation, which allows you only to spend 10% of your resources on activist work. And their argument was that that actually constrained what they were, that was an unfair constraint. We are fully nonpartisan. That is what we are not able to be, and nor would we want to be nonpartisan, because our focus is on policy itself, not on parties. And this is handy, right? I mean, because when you're actually advocating for good policy, theoretically, you would love for any party to actually take it on and use it as their own. I mean, anyway, I mean, the chances of that happening, depending on the party, are, range, but our mandate is nonpartisan, and largely we do not lobby, but because of the ambiguous nature of the wording of the old charity legislation, it was sort of up to the person doing the audit as to whether or not what you were doing was considered too activist, or if you broke through the 10% cap. The cap is gone now, which does give us the opportunity to engage in perhaps more direct discussion about policy options. We will still remain nonpartisan because, of course, you can't be a charity and be partisan. But also, it's not. I mean, I think that there's real benefit. There's actually, I think, a real freedom in being able to focus purely on the policy itself, because it does open up to it does allow you to insert yourself into debates right across the political spectrum and then be relevant to those debates across the political spectrum. So yes, the law has changed significantly. We'll start to see, I think, charities perhaps change some of their activities when it comes to activism, not partisanship, obviously, because that has no impact. I don't know. The content we produce will not change. I would, and certainly the nonpartisan nature obviously will not as well. But the law did really overhaul, I think, what we can and can't expect charities to do, or how we can limit them. So it'll be interesting to see how it starts manifesting itself. The Elections Act is something different, and that did actually have a role in the activities we were able to engage in during the writ period. But you can check out our blog to see what we did throughout that period and how we engaged with the policy proposals that were being made, and on what basis. So if you want to check out our blog, it's behindthenumbers.ca, and that will probably give you a really good overview of how we were able to engage in the debate that way while remaining within the confines of both the Election Act and the Charities Law. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Climate strike and public ed, yes. I think we should do it. No, I think certainly the corporate mapping project has talked a little bit about this insofar as how public education does find itself caught up in the encroachment and the influence of the oil and gas industry in particular, and what happens when public education is insufficiently funded and becomes more vulnerable to outside forces, both private donations by individuals, like perfectly well-meaning individuals, or individuals who would like to see things done differently, by community fundraising campaigns that just reinforce the inequities that already exist between schools, because of course some schools can raise far more than others. 'Twas ever thus, and larger corporate donations. And in the current location here, there is the potential for certain industries to have a greater influence in what is taught and how it's taught. One of my colleagues has done a fair bit of work on the issue of bias balance, which looks at how teachers or educators are reluctant to talk about right or wrong when it comes to, or take a position on. And this is not a comment on educators, or they're dealing with tremendous pressure as well, right? But there's also a huge amount of material and workshops that are presented by and facilitated by industry to inform of a certain perspective and to constrain the conversation and sort of open up the possibility that, well, perhaps you have one perspective, but there's this other perspective, and shouldn't you, in the interests of being objective, provide both and give both equal weight, and then just let the kids decide, because really, just recycle and it'll be fine. I like hyperbole. I think that there is no question that public education can play a tremendous role in, a just transition, and what a Green New Deal looks like and how we facilitate it. Because of course we have to, we're looking at how our public institutions are funded, what they do. the extent to which they're funded as well. And I think one of my colleagues has done some really interesting work looking at the concept of providing transitional funds for workers who will find themselves out of a job, and how do you do it? And of course, one way of taking care of it, or at least addressing it in a very universal, equitable way, is to say, you know what, we're going to fully fund post-secondary education and training, so you can dip in and out whenever you want, and you can re-educate yourself, retrain yourself, and you know, the world becomes a much bigger place when you have more options and you can actually pursue them, knowing that you are not going to be $60,000 in debt when you graduate and then have to pay that off too. So, the third question is more challenging. So I'm going to not go on a sort of a stream of consciousness rant, but I'm going to see if I can talk my way through a little bit of it. I think it's always important to be able to sort of stop and take a moment and see if something isn't working, if it's not resonating. Now's a really good time to actually talk to people on the ground and saying, why, you know, what should we be doing? You know, what about your lived experience is not being captured here? Is the messaging wrong? Is it the wrong point of entry? A friend of mine who used to do a lot of work on reserve for sexual health and reproductive rights would get so frustrated because she was working in the States at the time, and the Democrats would go in and they would say, you need to vote for this, you'll need to vote for this particular piece of legislation. And she said, you know, these are people who don't have clean drinking water. And sexual health and reproductive rights are a huge issue. So why are we not going in and providing education and providing birth control and providing, you know, a nurse to actually, you know, talk about these issues and provide them with that, that education and that health requirement, and then talking about how legislation connects with those things, right? It's a much longer process. But you're actually, you know, helping people who need help the most, and you're helping them on their own terms, right? And you're actually demonstrating the connection between activism, politics, and social progress on a much on a much broader scale, but on a much longer continuum as well. The other thing is, I think, you know, Nora was here earlier, Nora Loretto, and she and Sandy Hudson do this fantastic podcast, which I'm sure some of you had heard, but they did this amazing one. I mean, they were both from the student movement, and I work a lot with students. They did a great one on organizing. How do you organize? And just on reminding us that, you know, we think organizing is this, and it is a skill. I'm not trying to diminish that, but, you know, a lot of us have elements of, you know, an organizer in us. She was saying, if you've ever organized a birthday party for a friend, like, what do? You know, you sit down, you pick a date. You know, you sit down, you make a list of what needs to be done, you get a bunch of people together, you figure out who's going to do what, you know, you make sure people are going to come, they're going to show up, okay, if they, I mean, there are processes you go through to organize anything. And I think sort of trying to remind people that, you know, organizing isn't this sort of mystical thing that's out there that 10 people can do. I mean, we all have that ability. And the other thing that they pointed to, which I thought was really important, was sometimes things don't work well, but you'll learn not to do it again. And sometimes that's great. She was, they were talking about this one event where they decided they were going to drop a banner off an overhang, and it didn't work because, I mean, there wasn't traffic involved. That was not the issue. But the wind came and it just blew the thing away and nobody saw it. So she said, well, you know what? We're not going to do that again. So I think being really clear on what you hope to achieve from various different aspects of organizing. The other thing too is, you know, people will sign, getting people to sign a petition. There is the benefit to getting people to sign a petition isn't necessarily the fact that you have 75,000 names, which you're then going to send off to someone and hope that they will not put it in a drawer. I don't mean to depress people, but it's actually in having that conversation with everybody who's signing that petition about why they're there. What are you doing? What can you learn from them? 15 in Fairness has a fantastic organizing model where they literally train the trainer, and they do it on they provide a number of different ladders of engagement where people can get involved in ways that make sense to them at that moment, and then learn, and then eventually train others. So I think, Alberta, but look. Look, I am not trying to minimize how hard this is. And don't think that, I wrote this thing and I was like, okay, I've got it. And then I went, oh, it's Alberta. I know that, the UCP is now talking about potentially a full voucher for schools, but, schools, private schools already get 70% public funding. 70 in Alberta.
Unless you count, the building they need to have.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
so with
Yeah.
underserved children who are traumatized.
Yeah. Well, no, you're correct. I think it can get very murky. I know in Quebec it's 60%, in BC and Manitoba it's 50%. The problem with creeping neoliberalism is it opens up the possibility, it acclimatizes people to the slow creep of ultimate full privatization. And I think the good news is we have a lot of kids and a lot of schools and a lot of parents are concerned, and that's why I think if we can find those opportunities and that infrastructure that actually allows us to come together and say, okay, it's not working, why isn't it working, and where can we start making small gains? And sometimes those small gains are in talking to people you've never spoken with before, and often letting them lead the conversation, right? Because we've fallen far. And that's certainly what the Chicago teachers recognized, and it's why they literally had a takeover of their union by the Progressive Educators Caucus, because they had completely bought into that model of retail unionism, and not only had it completely divorced them from the city, the kids that they taught, it divorced them from their own members. So they really had to start at the beginning. And it's still tough, but they're making gains, and they are working much more effectively with the broader community in common purpose.
That was a great point, Erika, about learning from sometimes more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, and continue to kind of muddle through as long as you keep your eye on where you're going. Let's take another 3 questions here. I'm going to try to pick people who haven't had a chance so much throughout the conference. In the white sweater here, at the back in the red, and I'll find a third one. Someone, and way at the top here afterwards is the third one.
Me? Hi. Thank you very, very much, Erika. Every time, it's terrific when I hear you. Just a very quick note, in case some people don't know that Alberta Education has a survey on choice, and they'll want to know, for example, if you really feel you need to have more choice for your children and grandchildren, and all you have to do is say, no, got plenty, it's an easy survey to fill out. And all it will do, really, you don't have to provide any important arguments because they're not listening. They only want numbers. And so, I figure I learned something about data points at this conference, so I figure they'll all know that we live in the socialist heartland, and they'll also probably even know that we went to the Parkland conference if you do it tomorrow. However, in the interest of, numbers count, if everybody told every aunt and every sister and brother to fill out the survey, it'd probably be worth doing. It takes 5 minutes.
Hi. No question, but I'd like to provide some information. My name is Rose Reed. I am a member of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. I am the local chair at SAIT in Calgary, Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. On October 24th, we had an information picket to start to share information with regards to the cutbacks. AUPE has been doing information pickets since the beginning of the summer to try and educate the public, as well as our members on Kenny and the cuts and whatnot. So some information I'd like to share with you is after that, I was involved in a meeting that our chief financial officer had with our division. And the members of the support staff, there's approximately 700 of us at SAIT, and the faculty are very concerned about the cutbacks to post-secondary education. Our executive, our president, CFO, et cetera, and not so much. So here's just some quotes that were quoted during that meeting. So he started off the meeting by saying that Post-secondary education is no longer government funded, it is now government supported. He said that the post-secondary tuition fees for international students will be going up. Right now at SAIT, they're presently 2.5 times that of domestic students. He talked about, he's been at SAIT, I think, about 2 to 3 years. Prior to that, him and our present president, the two of them worked at a post-secondary institute in BC. And he was very proud of the fact that when they had a deficit there, over 2 years, they doubled tuition. And that's how they helped to cover that deficit. He said, quote, when he was talking about tuition, domestic tuition, he said, the price really doesn't matter. And when he was talking about that, what he was saying is they could double it or triple it. It doesn't matter. We're still going to get students coming. So he doesn't care how much the fees go up. He was talking about living standards within Alberta, and he was talking about the budget. He said, quote, living standards are lower now than they were 5 years ago, but that's okay because Albertans were still pretty well off.
Could we, do you have a question there as well that we
No
could?
question.
Okay, thank you. And then at the back here, third one.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I also have more of a sort of a comment, but also a question, kind of both. So I work for the Alberta Public Interest Research Group here on campus at the U of A. And our mandate is basically to serve undergraduate students in pursuit of a better active participation and awareness of social justice issues and anti-oppressive methods in daily life, period. And I noticed, like, even at this conference, this is not supposed to be some kind of opinioning critique, but there's just not enough young people here. Yeah, stand up for that. And I think APERC can help with that, is why I'm bringing it up, because we are on campus at the U of A. We're positioned to be able to address undergrads directly. And we need to do it consistently all the time for the next indefinitely, but the next 2 years are crucial. And I think that the only thing that I would say is not missing but needs extra emphasis is that we're not organizing, advocating, and actively pursuing changes on behalf of students. We have to be doing it with students. And with like every age of student, and I feel from experience and also just from working now in the not-for-profit sector as a person who is tasked with the address of students, that there are limited ways of encouraging post-secondary age students who are engaged in their institutions in any way, on whatever spectrum, to feel hopeful, effective, agentic in the pursuit of changes that will benefit them. It's a huge problem. Yeah, and I think the best way to address this to start with that I can see, which I'm very biased in, of course, is to work with the PIRGs. Like, work with the PIRGs. We're all over the country. If y'all don't know what PIRGs are, look them up online. Write to your PIRG, email the people at the PIRGs, and figure out a way to use the funding that we are endowed with by the tuition of these students to get this word out a little bit more and to invite them in. Because I don't feel that they feel invited to this conversation. I feel like it happens around them. And I say them. Last year, I was an undergrad, so it's me as well. And now I'm a grad student, so it's still me as well. And I guess the question is, in a concrete, maybe not concrete, but in a practical way, share your contacts with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, not just
100%.
you, but like all of you, share your contacts with me. It's a thing. I come to conferences, people share contacts, and nothing happens after. And we can't have that happening anymore because it's too close to the wire.
So just to add to that, yes, 100%. I mean, when you actually have an organized student group like PARG that has a funding base, like and a mechanism to actually capture that funding and continue to do that work, support them, because it's a remarkable opportunity for young people to directly impact the communities, their educational communities, and it's a fleeting period of time, right? I mean, it's 4 years goes by quickly, and year over year things can change. I mean, at Canadian Federation of Students, they're elected for 1-year terms. That's a quick turnover, and we just saw in Ontario how quickly governments in a position to do so will go after student groups and go after their funding. It's been devastating to CFS Ontario and therefore CFS National, because they've now made effectively it right to work when it comes to student fees in Ontario. So it's like it's like a dues check off now. When you have mechanisms that remain like CFS in other provinces and like the PERGs here, they need support. I mean, they're a remarkable opportunity for young people to actually learn organizing skills, right? Like learn about their community, learn how to take an issue, turn it into a campaign, and have some success with it. I mean, I've known the PERGs for years, so I'm nice to meet you. No, so I wholeheartedly support those institutions, and we need to as well. And you're right. I mean, we need, when I said mentorship works both ways, I meant it, and that's generational too.
Were there a couple of other?
Yeah, if anybody wants to. I'm leaving this up to you.
We'll take 2 more questions at this point. So just right in front here in the white and black jacket. Yeah, just down here. Yeah. And one more here. And just right here. Yeah. Sure. Those 2, and then we'll wrap it up.
So my question is, how do we prevent silos from occurring? Because the Canadians Without Poverty is a group that I'm fairly close to, but I don't see anybody represented here. I just came from a rural development meeting that talked about crime. They're not here. So how do we stop looking at our own belly buttons and kind of negating other groups and start building coalitions that can work together for change?
I want to address alumni. The representative from SAIT is someone that I should be speaking to as an alumnus of SAIT, and many of us are alumni of public schools, high schools, post-secondary educational institutes nationally, and I think we could be really helpful to those places that are under attack, so we need to be engaged, and we will give support.
Okay.
Was there a third question? Just the 2?
We'll just take the 2.
Okay. How do we prevent silos? That's a good question, and I think it's actually been touched on by a few folks here. We need to start talking to our neighbors. We need to start taking a really good look at who's not in the room, and we don't do that enough. I think as things get really bad, ideally that we start doing that a little bit more, right? I think it starts working across generations, it starts working across sectors, and it starts by looking at opportunities to pull people to unlikely allies together. One of the projects we have at CCPA is the Alternative Federal Budget, which we chair, but it does tend to pull groups who might not necessarily sit down at a table together where we have to sort of hammer out policy differences. I mean, how do you bring one of the focuses is on sustainability and a just transition, but we also have workers who, work in the tar sands. They're at the table too. So how are we addressing that? What does a sustainable work plan and workforce look like? And how can we come up with something that actually addresses those concerns, right? I'm very fond of the postal workers, and I found it really interesting to see how the discussion of post office closure, particularly in rural communities, became a really interesting organizing point for people who would never sit down and talk. I mean, conservative MPs at the point who were in opposition were really upset because their constituents, also conservative, were really upset about the closure of their rural post office. So, I mean, postal banking, another issue that actually can address like loss of banking services in remote communities or in underserved communities. So I think looking for opportunities to actually start working across sectors, across ages and generations, across socioeconomic groups, I mean, we have to get better at identifying those. And that's part of the reason why I find education so fascinating and frankly so uplifting, is because it has the potential to do that. We need to get better at recognizing it, and it's a lot of work. I'm not trying to minimize the amount of work, like looking around the room and seeing who's not just who's there, but who isn't, and then making a concerted effort to actually identify who we need to talk to, and that you want, next meeting, I commit to bringing 3 people I don't know very well, and we're going to make that meeting grow. So that's, I mean, it's not an answer. I think it's sort of more a challenge. And for that, I apologize because I know people are busy.
So one of the things I was hoping we could get back to is the educational system to teach communication skills, to teach networking skills, to teach organizing skills, to teach coming together as communities.
I think, sure, yes, but I think it goes beyond. Yes, it can teach organizing and communication skills, but I've talked to a lot of you here today, and you're all very good communicators. I think sometimes it's not a question of formalizing. I think it's a question of informalizing it and just having conversations with your friends, and talking to people in line when you're checking out, not self-checkout. What I find interesting is, so a lot of people in Ontario are wearing their No Cuts to Education pins. They're great conversation starters. And those are really interesting, right? Because you actually, it's certainly riding a bit of a wave, but there are signals that you want to talk about things, and I think we need to get better at actually identifying those moments. And sometimes it's traumatizing. There are some people. Sometimes people really don't like initiating those conversations, and sometimes we have to push ourselves to do it a little bit more. Start with, I'll talk to my aunt. She won't listen, but no.
Well, I just want to, in wrapping this up, one of the things that Parkland has done in 23 years of its existence is we always try to talk about things that are important to what's going on in Alberta, but we also try to bring the rest of the world in and also show how things that are happening here are not that strange that from things happening elsewhere. And I think this conference has succeeded in doing that to a large extent. We also try to not only analyze what is going on and tell people this is what you're facing, but we always try to also suggest ways that you can actually act, right? Praxis, so that you can actually go about trying to change the world. And I think what we've gotten here this afternoon to finish off with Erika is something, gives us some really good ideas about what we need to do, how to go about doing it, to create the better world, the kind of commons that we want to build and reestablish once again in this province and elsewhere. So Erika, thanks so much for coming here today.
Thanks.
It's been wonderful.